Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar for the Natur and Byth project. This week, we're going to be looking at invertebrates instead. And in fact, it doesn't look like a real screen that's behind me, but this is actually our entomological collections here at Cymru, the National Museum at Cardiff, where we have about 1 million or just over 1 million specimens. I'm going to start off the talk, but first of all, just say happy Pancake Day to anybody who partakes in such activities. We're going to knuckle down today for a good hour and a half, couple of hours for a talk. So this is a good opportunity to go and make your pancakes, make a cup of tea, and strap yourselves in. All right, I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Okay, and we're off. Okay, so this particular talk, we're going to talk about some of the rarer insects that occur in Wales, particularly these ones that occur in North Wales. They're all part of the Natur and Byth project. This is me. My name's Tom Dallymore, and I'm one of the curators here at the museum. My job here is to look after the collections, and also conduct research and work with fantastic groups of people who are interested in insect conservation. Just a little bit of an outline for what is happening during the talk. We're going to just cover a few subjects, and then we're going to have a bit of a 10-minute break, which won't matter so much because this is a recording, so you can obviously stop this at any time and take a break and then come back to it. We're going to split this talk into two halves. So the first half of the talk is going to be about the Clubbed General Soldierfly, and the second half is going to be about the cliff mason bee. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Don't worry too much about putting your microphones on mute because I can't hear you. We are going to have this webinar translated into Welsh, so there should be a video available similar to this in a Welsh translation, and we'll get that out as soon as we possibly can, hopefully at the same time as this video. Okay, so yeah, what we would kind of hope to do is using the museum collections here to try and help show people how to recognize species of conservation importance, show the sort of habitats that they can be found in, and show what sort of conservation strategies that the Natur and Byth project and partners are doing to try and help these species. Because you may or may not be aware of the work that's been going on nationally, and it's really important. And these kind of webinars are really here to try and help promote this kind of work and help a broader understanding of some of the species that are covered within the project. And a lot of these species, because they're a little bit less obvious maybe than the sorts of species that people are used to finding in conservation projects, maybe a little bit less charismatic, although we tend to think they are quite charismatic. We're a little bit biased. But some of these species can be quite difficult to find and difficult to recognize. So one of the things we're hoping to do this webinar is just to give you a few teasers so that, you never know, you may come across some of these species and you may be able to identify them. So what is the Natur and Byth project? If you're not aware of this, it's a flagship green recovery project that has 10 core partners, including NGOs and government bodies, and they've pulled together a significant amount of funding that's going to help run multiple projects for conservation across Wales. The museum is not one of the core partners, but we're obviously involved in doing this kind of outreach work as part of the project. So the Natur and Byth project targets 67 rare and threatened species. These are species that are considered to be some of Wales's most at-risk species. There are others, but these are core species that we think that could make a bit of difference towards their existence if the project were to work well. And it's sort of clustered in amongst 11 projects, and this map here shows you where those project areas are. There's a number of different projects that are running within these particular regions to try and help these species in the list, including habitat restoration work, specific targeted species work, public outreach work, that kind of thing. But what you'll notice is that there's 17 species on that list that are insects and spiders. And this is actually quite novel in many ways because generally speaking, less maybe with the exception of butterflies and the occasional moth, insects are really generally overlooked when it comes to big nature conservation projects. So it's absolutely fantastic that Natur and Byth is recognising some of the more at-risk species that are smaller and maybe easy to overlook by people, So when you look at the list, actually, there's only one butterfly species and one moth species, and the rest are all of other groups. So there's beetles, caddisflies, stoneflies, that kind of thing. So it's something different. It's really fascinating. It's really interesting, and we're really excited about this project. But the two species that we're going to focus on today is the fly, Stratiomus chameleon, which is the Clubbed General, and Osmia xanthomilana, which is the large mason bee. So these are the two we're going to focus on as we go through the webinar. Now, just before we start, we've got a little video that tells you a little bit more about the museum and the museum's role in what it does for the public. So,
welcome to Cardiff, the capital city of Wales. It's great to be in the middle of town and out in the park. And just over there is a building where you can see stunning natural objects from all over the planet and the entire natural history of the world. It's Wales's very own Natural History Museum, and we're going to show you a bit about how it works. This building has been open for over 100 years. Every year we have more than 250,000 visitors. Have you had a look yet? On display we have showcases of Welsh habitats, animals and plants from every part of the globe, including some beautifully crafted wax models, some exquisite rocks and valuable minerals, and we tell the whole story of the evolution of Wales. And yes, we do have dinosaurs. Exhibitions are only a part of the work that we do. The objects you see on display are only the tip of an iceberg. Behind the scenes, we've got over 5 million more, and they're used in all kinds of research projects, events, and activities. To find out more, we need to go behind the scenes.
Mae ein curaduron wrth ei bodd yn siarad am y gwaith sy'n digwydd tu ôl y llen yn y amgueddfa. Weithiau mae pobl yn dod i weld y casgliadau fel hyn. Dyma lle rydyn ni'n cadw yr specimenau sydd wedi eu cadw mewn alcohol, fel mwydod, cregyn, crancod, cymwchiaid, sermôr a'r mwy. Mae llawer o specimenau yn dod o ymchwil amgueddfa. Mae anghenfilod o traethiau Cymru gyda ni. Mae pob gwrthrych yn y amgueddfa yn dweud stori.
Insects are the most diverse animal group. For instance, there's over 250 species of bees in the UK, and only one of them actually makes honey. Also, they're very fiddly. Organising a scientific insect collection requires a lot of work and skill. Microscopes are essential, whether you're a student, a trainee, or an experienced entomologist. Thousands of new species of insects are still being discovered. At this museum, we have described hundreds over the years. The first specimens of each one are preserved and remain available to other scientists to study and borrow.
Like all scientists, we publish our results in international journals. The museum has published over 1,000 papers on its collections-based research.
A museum is the best place to compare one species with almost any other, and we have the most complete collection of Welsh flora and fauna in the world. We've used the collections to make several identification guides, which are used well beyond the museum. This, for example, is the go-to guide for British cockles, mussels and clams. We've even used them to produce guides for other countries whose biodiversity is less well known. We can also identify non-native species that have recently arrived in the UK and could become a threat.
Rhai o'n specimenau mwyau poblogaidd yw'r vertebratau, anifeiliaid gydag asgwrn cefn fel adar, mammaliaid ac molysgiaid. Mae llawer ohonyn nhw wedi cael ei benthyg gan amgueddfeydd arall, orielau ac ysgolion. Hefyd, mae gwyddonwyr yn defnyddio'r specimenau ar gyfer samplu DNA. Mae hyn yn helpu ni i ddysgu mwy am poblogaethau anifeiliaid ledled y byd. Mae llawer o'n specimenau wedi dod o zooau a pharciau anifeiliaid fel Bili y Morlo a Brin y Teiger.
In Wales, we have 800 species of moss. We can collect mosses in Wales from sand dunes to mountains, and we dry them and we put them in packets. And with a little bit of water, we can rejuvenate these collections and study them and figure out what they are and tell us about what the environment was like where they were collected from. Our specimens help us look at how distributions of species change over time, and we collect these and we use our databases to map our collections and see these changes.
Diatoms are single-celled algae less than 0.5 millimeters long. The museum has a collection of more than 7,000 samples stored on glass slides. We are studying diatoms to monitor pollution and climate change in rivers and lakes.
This is the fossil of a little dinosaur called Dracoraptor. It was found by some amateur collectors and we were lucky enough to have it donated to us. Little Dracoraptor was one of the first carnivorous dinosaurs from Wales. The bones themselves are fairly well preserved and they have been three-dimensionally scanned so that the public can see those on our website and rotate them and look in each direction.
That's a quick look around, but this building is only the beginning. Our work takes us far and wide, from fieldwork in remote regions to installing exhibitions at other museums and a wide range of public events around Wales. We look forward to seeing you soon at Wales's Natural History Museum, and get in touch if you have any questions. Hwyl am y dro!
Fantastic. There we go. So there's a bit of a tease about the museum and what the museum does. Some people think that we're just a display for the public at the front of the house, but actually we do an awful lot of science work and behind the scenes as well. If anybody's interested in coming to visit the museum and wants to look at our collections, then please do get in touch. I've got the email address for the entomological department at the end. So if you want to come and see what it is that we've got, or you think our collections might be useful to you, then drop us a line. Okay, so let's start with what makes an insect rare, because it's quite an interesting definition. Not everyone necessarily knows what a rare insect actually is, but there are some fixed definitions that we follow that help us understand what makes an insect rare. And they're protected by several different legislations. So, for example, there's 167 insect species that are covered under the Environment Act for Wales in 2016, and they were considered as species of principal importance for conservation. And also under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, there's 48 insect species that are in which it's illegal to collect or disturb or trade in these species. A large number of those are butterflies in the Wildlife and Countryside Act, but still, so there's probably more there that are protected than you might think. How do they decide? How do we know what a rare species is? Because you look outside your window, you might find something you've never seen in your garden before, but does that make it rare? Well, we have a number of different systems in the UK that help us to decide what's rare. And one of them is known as the Great Britain Rarity System. And essentially, it's about the number, rather than being the number of individuals that are known about, it's about the number of 10 square kilometres that they occupy. So for a naturally rare species, it means that they're only recorded or they're only known from between 1 to 15 British hectads. So that's 10 by 10 kilometre squares. I mean, they may be only, for example, if they're only in one 10k square, it may be that they may be on 3 or 4 different sites, but only within that 1 kilometre square. They might be nationally scarce, which is 16 to 100 hectads. But there's a number of different categories, older categories that still pop up, because there's a huge number, it's like 24,000 species or something of insects in the UK. It takes a long time for us to go through and review the status of all these species. So there's some old categories that you might come across too. For example, there's the RDB list, which is a red data book. And this basically categorizes insects into endangered, vulnerable, or rare, or insufficient data. And some of these kind of follow a similar system. It's mostly about abundance and distribution of species. So really, it's about the number of square 10k squares that they inhabit is probably quite key for that kind of thing. Okay, so moving on, let's crack on with our species in question. And we're going to start by talking about the Clubbed General, which is Strateomyes chameleon. That's the scientific name, but you can call it the Clubbed General if you like. I'm going to switch between the two as I go through. So let's start at the basics. So what's a soldier fly? You may not have come across soldier flies before. You may not have heard of soldier flies before. But our little fellow Strateomyes chameleon is a soldier fly, and it's a bee mimic or a wasp mimic. And there's a lot of species that exhibit this kind of behaviour. And I've got a few on the screen here for you to look at. Interestingly, you'll be pleased to know that not all these are flies. There are other things in here, so other different kinds of mimics, of wasp mimics. And we all know yellow and black is the sort of universal warning system. So a lot of these species have evolved this color type to try and protect themselves from being eaten. And many of them, of course, are not dangerous in the slightest. They're just pretending. So yeah, have a little look at this and have a think. Well, which ones of these are wasps? Which ones are bees? Which ones are flies? I have put a sneaky one in here actually, which is actually neither. And that's this little one in the corner. That's actually a day-flying moth. This is the current clearwing, which also mimics a wasp as well. So, you know, it's going to be easy to get confused between these if you don't really know what you're looking for. So let's have a look. What's the difference between flies and bees? So this is how they separate out. Hopefully you picked up these when you were looking at the pictures. You could tell them apart. But there are differences that make life easy for us so we can split flies and bees and wasps. First of all, the number of wings. This is always a dead giveaway. They've got one pair of wings and usually what they call halters, which is a little stubby thing that sits behind the wings that helps them balance when they're flying. It's more than likely going to fall into the flies. Bees and wasps have 2 wings. They also have a broad waist. Flies, I'll show you in a second. And rounded eyes as well. So that kind of defines the flies. By comparison, the wasps and bees tend to have longer antennae. This is not a guaranteed, but generally speaking, they're really long. They have 2 pairs of wings, which sometimes can be difficult to see if they've got them folded behind themselves. But they also have a very narrow waist, and that's where the term hymenoptera comes from this sort of hymenated narrow abdomen. And that's very typical of bees and wasps, whereas in the flies, it's much broader. A lot of bees and wasps also have a little notch. You can't really see that there in the eye, which makes them look a little bit angry, whereas the flies are much more rounded, and which sometimes makes them look a little bit more friendly, I guess. I don't know. Okay, so you can tell the difference between a fly and a bee and a wasp. That's quite helpful when you want to know what a soldier fly is. But what's the difference between soldier flies and hoverflies? Hoverflies are quite similar things. When you look at them, if you look at these 2 pictures, they can be quite difficult to tell apart at first glance. But there are some cues that can help you along here. So first of all, we're going to look at the wings. This is a sort of defining feature, really. Now, you might not be able to see this very clearly, but if you're really nifty with a camera, like Andrew is here, you can see the picture on the right. You might be able to pick up some detail in the actual veins of the wings. And they're quite different when you look up closely. So the soldier flies, the stratomyids, they have this cell. It's like an obvious cell that you can see there. Other flies do have cells in their wings, but hoverflies don't. So if you're unsure between hoverflies and soldier flies, then you can see there's a cell there, which is quite clear. And in the hoverflies, they have what's called a false vein. It's like a fold in the wing. And if I can just see, if I'll just go backwards and forwards on that, you can just see that this fold that runs there in the middle of the wing. That's quite key, a quick key feature for identifying hoverflies. Of course, the problem is that you might not necessarily be able to tell the difference just from the wings. So you can. There is some other indicators that you might be able to use. So, for example, the soldier flies often generally speaking, have slightly longer antennae, particularly the first antennal segment. What's the one at the base near the head is sometimes a little bit longer. Not always, may I just add, but sometimes a bit longer. In hoverflies, they tend to be a bit on the shorter side. It doesn't happen all the time, I have to admit, but it can be a bit of a guide to help you through. They also, the way they sit with their bodies is quite different. So hoverflies tend to be quite fat and sausagey, whereas the soldier flies, they tend to hold their wings behind them, and they have a much flatter body. We'll look at this in a bit more detail later on when we get to see the specimens. But you can see from this picture on the left that the hoverflies, they really do tuck their wings in tight, whereas the hoverflies tend to sit with their wings sticking outwards. So there's a bit of a difference there that you can pick up between the 2. So these are a few different soldier flies that you can find. they've all got really fancy names after him at the Soldierfly. So we've got the Broad Centurion and the common green colonel. No surprises, a lot of the common names have a kind of military theme to them. I think, as far as I'm aware, the naming of the Soldierfly came from from actually the banded nature of some of the species. They kind of look like the military, like what are they called? The stripes that the stripes that soldiers will have on their shoulder. I can't remember what they're called now. It's totally lost. Epaulets. There we go. I've been waving an epaulette sign from the corner. That's the one. Thanks, Ben. So that's, as far as I'm aware, that's where the original naming came from, and it's kind of sort of spiraled from there. But you can see not all of them have that stripy feature, but most of them have these kind of flat bodies, these really sort of flat, parallel-sided abdomens. And these ones have obviously been pinned with their wings open, so they wouldn't sit like this normally in the wild. There is 49 species of soldier flies in the UK, so they're not a massive group as it goes in the UK. So if you're really interested in getting into flies and you want a group to learn about, they're actually a really nice group because there's not too many that you can lose your way with. And there's some really nice information out there, some really nice up-to-date guides and identification keys. I'll show you. At the end of this talk, I'll give you some nice reference information that you can use. So they're a really nice group to get into. So we're interested in the soldier flies that are in the genus Strateomyes. That's the Strateomyid soldier flies. And it makes life simple for us because there's only 4 species really within this genus, and that simplifies things. It can make things a little bit more easy. But how do we identify a Strateomyes? That's the key question. Well, there's a few things you can look for. First of all, on the scutellum, that's this sort of just behind the big hunchy black bit, which is the thorax behind the head. There's this sort of spiky spiky plate. In this particular genus, they have 2 long spines. There are some genera within soldier flies that have 4, but in this one, it has 2. You can see them; they're quite clear there to see. They're a very distinctive group, really. These big, flat, stripy things. They also have very long first antennae, so they sort of really do protrude from the head quite significantly compared to other soldier flies, and they're really obvious when you get your eye in. So there's the 4 species that we've got. There's the banded general, the clubbed general, the longhorned general, and the flecked general. Now, for those keener-eyed amongst you, you might be able to spot some differences just by glancing at the screen. They are fairly distinct between the 4, to be fair, but there are some crossed over features that can trick you if you're not careful. So we'll have a look at some of those things that really help you separate them. Now, what we've tried to do is I've tried to set this up so that it's features that you can identify in the field so that you don't need to get your microscope out and have a closer look that you might be able to do with a hand lens or a really good camera. So if there's any features there are additional features, but you might need to follow them through the key. And given that the club general is a pretty rare fly, I would not recommend killing specimens to take home to identify if you can. If you have photographic images and you want to get them confirmed, then their iRecord is a really useful resource for posting images, and there are other platforms available that will help you with your identifications. The first thing to look for is the coloration on the front and mid tibia. So you can see from this picture, there's one at the top there. The front tibia looks quite yellowish, and the one below, it looks quite darky black, sort of blacky brown. And that's quite distinct. That's quite a distinctive feature that you can see. And what that does is that splits your 4 species into 2 groups. So the first one with the yellow tibias, it gives you the banded general and the club general. So the species we're interested in will be all yellow front and mid tibias. The other 2 species, the flecked general and the longhorn general, they're darker, much darker. So if they've got a dark tibia, then it's not the species that we're talking about today. Once you've looked at the tibia and you can work out which group you fall into, after that it's a little bit easier, actually, to be fair, because the club general is named after these patterns on the abdomen, which are really clear, kind of club-shaped. Whereas in the banded general, they're sort of pointy. That's probably the best way to describe it. Obviously, somebody considers it to be banded. I call them pointed. There you go. Each to their own, I suppose. So yeah, they're quite easy to tell apart in that respect. So if you use those features to follow through, then hopefully that will help you decipher between them. Annoyingly, sometimes these flies can sit with their wings tucked back, and the clubbed thing can be quite difficult to spot. So if you're wondering whether you've got a club general or banded general, then it can be quite challenging. So you can collect your soldier flies into a pot so that you can view them and try and get a look with the wings open. They will part their wings and open them from time to time. So if you've got the patience, you can just sit and watch them and then try and get some photographs or get a view of them with their wings open. It's sometimes quite helpful. So I've got a nice image here. This is the club general. Just to give you a bit of a close-up, a little bit of 3D rotation. If you can look how sort of flat the abdomen is, and it has this sort of almost like a fringe along the side, which makes it look even flatter. It's quite a hairy little beast, but not as hairy as some of the other strateomyids. And this is a female of the species. So how do we know that was a female? Well, you can tell by looking at how close together their eyes are. Yeah, you can see, so in the males here, this is actually from a different species, but the same principle applies. So you can see that their eyes are very close together. They have quite a narrow gap in between them. Whereas in the females, they have really broad eyes, so they're quite far apart. And that's very distinctive. And you can see that. You can pick that up very easily with a hand lens in the field. So what kind of habitat are you likely to find the banded general in? Well, they like they're very specific. It's probably one of the reasons why they're so rare is that they have very particular requirements for habitats. So they like sort of calcium-rich flushes and fens, often that are associated with rich tufa deposits. And if you don't know what tufa is, it's essentially a sort of precipitated limestone that appears. It almost looks a bit like pumice in its appearance, and they're quite distinctive and mostly associated with limestone habitats. So that it's not a common habitat, really, a calcareous fen in the UK. So that doesn't help its distribution, full stop. But that's the kind of places that it likes. This image here is one where it's found in Oxfordshire, and you can see actually if we go back that I know there's ones in winter, but there's some vegetation differences. So it's more about the underlying mineral, how exposed the areas are, and that there's movement of water. So sometimes you do get slightly different plants in those habitats. So a little bit on the life cycle. This is a really nice illustration that's from 1896 that shows the club general's life cycle. And when you look at it, it looks a little bit alien because the larvae on the ground look like something weird, something out of Star Trek. But actually, they are that weird in real life, to be fair. And they lay their eggs like most species, but they're quite significant numbers. So they can, I think the highest recorded is 636 eggs, which was laid over 5 hours. There's some fantastic photographs here that Judy Webb produced of the life cycle of the club general. Once the eggs hatch, the larvae obviously appear, and this is it's not very clear in this image. This is it sort of mooching around in amongst the vegetation, but they're really quite large. So yeah, you can see they're up to 35 millimeters long. So that's a big old larvae by any standards, especially compared to the size of the adult, which is quite a big fly, but the larvae is considerably larger. They're quite distinctive as well in their appearance. So they have this kind of baseball bat shape. So they have this larger head, which then sort of filters down to a narrow tail, sort of long tail, which is used for breathing for the water surface. So sometimes they'll dangle down with their abdomen sticking up through the surface of the water, like a breathing siphonal tube. And they can be quite easy to find, to be fair. I say that. At certain times of year, they can be easy to find. So there's a picture of Claire here. She's laying out some bait, and she uses grapefruit, believe it or not. Not entirely sure how this experimental design came about, but it seems that if you place out a load of grapefruits and let them go rotten, then after a few weeks, if you go back and look at them, then they tend to attract the Strateomyes larvae. And that's not just the Clubbed General. They will also attract other Strateomyids. So if you live near a fen that may not have that particular rare species in, then you might be able to use this as a guide. You can also attract other things to it as well, caddisfly larvae and such like that really like to chew on old grapefruits, which is really strange. The larvae will often be found on the edge of slow-flowing flushes, so there likes a bit of movement in the water. But it's interesting because where the sort of the little stream from the flush will flow, they tend to be more on the margins rather than in the strong current. But they will also mooch around on the surface as well, as you'll see in a video shortly. Well, they like this sort of very low vegetation. It's got to be very low, very open kind of vegetation. If it gets too scrubbed up, then that's detrimental to their well-being. So you tend to lose them if the conditions get too rank. There we go. Okay, this is a fantastic video that Judy Webb put together. It might be worth just noting that this may or may not be a species of the Clubbed General. It's found in similar habitat. However, the larvae can be of this particular genus can be exceptionally difficult to separate, and there's no way you really be able to do that by eye in the field. So you don't really know what you've got until they're reared to adult at this stage. But you know that you've got a Strateomys larvae because they're big and fantastic. Yeah, there you go. So you can see the way it moves. Kind of, it's very distinctive. I don't even know how you describe that kind of crawl, like a creep, I guess, as it sludges its way across the surface. But it's very distinctive. It's a huge old thing. So you can see it's not always in the water at this point. It's moving across the surface, but it's still in that sort of open vegetation. And it's quite easy to see once it's actually moving. You do keep your eyes open when you go out into any fens or any wetlands, because even though you're unlikely to find a Clubbed General, there's a good chance that you might find a different Strateomyid using that method. There we go. That's a larvae. So they can be larvae for about 3 years. So they can hang around for quite a long time before they emerge as adults. It gives them a bit of breathing space, depending on the weather changes and so forth. But when they pupate, they don't look too different. They kind of just look like a crusty version of the larvae, to be fair, of which the adults will eventually emerge. There we go. And the adults are usually around in late June to early September. And you often spot them sitting on umbellifers, so hogweed in particular, but other things as well, depending on what's around and what's available near to the habitat. So it's really key for them. They get a lot of nectar from umbellifers. So it's a really important part of their management to make sure that they're included in the management plan for this species. You can see them, but not just for the Clubbed General, but also for other soldier flies. They do tend to like umbellifers, many of the species. So if you want to get into your soldier flies and you want to find a place to go and see them, then go and go and look on your photograph your umbellifers, your hogweed, and your wild carrots and so forth, or do a bit of sweeping around there. That's probably the best place to try and find soldier flies. And we've got a little video. So myself and Ben Rosen, who very kindly filmed this for us, we went up to Anglesey to try and find some of the Strateomyid larvae so that we could film it. We went in the winter on what was probably the sunniest, brightest day of the year. So you'll have to excuse the glare on the camera. The camera really struggled a little bit with the low winter light. So we've put this little video together for you of our experience up there. Oh, we've gone crazy. Hang on a sec. Where are we going? There we go. Okay. welcome to our virtual field trip. So we're out here today well, we're not going to tell you exactly where we are. This is quite a small private site, but it's part of the Anglesey SAC Fens, and we're here for a reason. So I'm here with Mike Howe from Natural Resources Wales and Claire Sampson from the RSPB, who is one of our Natur and Byth people. And yeah, so we're out here for a day. So let's start with Mike. So Mike, why are we here? Where are we?
Why are we standing on this wetland site at the end of January?
That's a very good question.
That is a good question. I would be in the office normally at this time of year because entomology is a summer sport. This is a small wetland site on Anglesey, which is part of the Anglesey Fens SAC. It probably supports one of the best stands of alkaline fen in Wales, one of the largest as well, despite being a small site. Alkaline fen is characterised by open shallow runnels, often with tufa deposits, calcareous in nature, and with schienous tussocks. And alkaline fen is well known to be an important habitat for a suite of specialist and rare invertebrates. And one of those species is the Clubbed General Stratiomus chameleon, which is a large, very attractive soldier fly, which most of its British populations are on Anglesey. There's about half a dozen to 10 sites on Anglesey, and otherwise in Britain it's only known from a couple of sites in around Oxford and one site on the Black Isle in Scotland. So conserving the species or preserving the species here is of paramount importance given the importance of its Anglesey sites. The fly's on the wing in July, August time. It's in the larval stage for 3 years, so it's possible to find larvae now, but because it's so cold and the water's cold, the larvae are probably pretty inactive, so we have trouble finding it.
And we tried. It's a sunny day, which is a miracle.
It is, yeah. And the site is very wet, and we have had a problem over the last few years, certainly with the summer droughts, of the site getting very desiccated, drying out, which will have a major impact upon these invertebrate populations. The soldier fly itself is adapted to desiccation. The larvae, as I say, can live up to 3 years, and they secrete calcium carbonate into their exoskeletons, and in that they can sit out periods of desiccation. But if that's regular and frequent, then the chances are that they won't survive those. But one-off periods of desiccation they're fine with. And the concern here on the Anglesey wetlands is that, you know, if the summer droughts continue as the pattern we've seen over the last few years, then it will have a major impact upon the entire invertebrate faunas, and particularly these specialist species.
So we've been placing, or as I say, you came out a few days ago and braved the storms and placed out some.
It wasn't like this when I came out last week.
You braved it and placed out some hollowed out grapefruits, halves of grapefruits in and around the site. Tell us a bit. Why are we putting grapefruits out?
Well, it's long been known. The key expert on soldier flies in Britain is Alan Stubbs, who used to work in the conservation agencies but has retired and founded Buglife. And he found that it's putting out half grapefruits, empty grapefruits. You eat the grapefruit fruit and you put out the grapefruit skins into runnels. When they start rotting down, they can attract a suite of species, including soldier fly larvae. They're detritus feeders, and they seem to be attracted to the rotting fruit. We've seen today that we haven't found any soldier flies, unfortunately, but we found a lot of caddisfly larvae. So even in the short time that they've been here and rotting, they have attracted a suite of invertebrates. So it's a tried and tested technique, not one I've used myself very much, but certainly on the Oxfordshire sites, it's a well-used technique to monitor the species there.
So does it work with other Stratiomyia, so other
yes. I mean, on this site we have 3 or 4 species of soldier fly, not quite as rare as the Clubbed General, 2 or 3 oxyceras, and they're much smaller, but they are attracted to the fruit as well. Yeah.
So Claire, what are the management challenges on this site, and what's the outlook for the Clubbed General? Is it good, do you think, or is it on its way out?
So the Clubbed General Soldierfly is one of the very rare, one of 17 very rare species that we're trying to preserve in the Natur and Byth project in this area on Pen Clean and Ynys Môn. And so by that very nature, it is restricted to some very small areas. So it's a big challenge for us to try and bring it back and preserve it for future generations to enjoy. It is the most spectacular, wonderful fly. And
yes, it is a great looking thing, yeah.
And so on this site, there are three main challenges. What we're doing is, firstly, we're monitoring. You've seen with the grapefruit to see where is it breeding on these sites. Secondly, we're looking at the hydrology of the sites. So we've got a problem with the sites drying out in the summer. We've got global warming, so there's climate change challenges. So we're working with farmers and landowners to see, to keep the water clean, to keep it at a certain level, to keep the habitat right so that the soldier flies can breed. And then the third thing we're doing is looking at the grazing regime for the sites, so that you can see they like this nice open habitat. And we've had students from Bangor University who've come in and they've helped by getting rid of some of this scrub, like the gorse that you can see there and some of the small willows. Because if that encroaches on the site, it inevitably dries it out further, so it can be this nice open area. And you said, what's the hope? Is that going to be enough? And I think the answer to that is to come back in 3 years' time. So we'll be seeing whether we've managed to expand its habitat. The other thing is that the adults, they like to feed on these umbellifery flowers. So we have to make sure that the larvae have got nice, clean, shallow runnels to breed in, and that the adults have got the umbellifery to feed on.
Which is quite important in invertebrate conservation, because often people just think about the adult requirements and not necessarily about what the larvae require. So I suppose it's important to manage all those different stages, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. So you grazed, the site's grazed as well. So
on this site, it's actually a commonest site, and there's two little Shetland ponies who are here most of the year, who do a very good job just keeping some of the open areas. But obviously there's some plants that they don't like to eat so much, like gorse. So we give them a bit of helping hand there, trying to remove the gorse and keep some of that scrub open.
Fantastic. Most of us have the same thing with broccoli, I think. Yeah, we don't get much help with eating that, though. That's the problem. Sprouts at Christmas. Fantastic. Thank you.
I like sprouts.
I like sprouts. Thank you, Claire. Yeah, I'll try that.
Okay, there we go. I hope you enjoyed that. It's a little bit informative. It's always really nice to speak to the people who do the work on the ground on these projects. I think we need to give them some recognition because they do a fantastic job. Right, so let's have a little bit of a talk about the status of the Clubbed General. As you can see from this map, it's almost historically was fairly broadly distributed around the UK, although it was still considered rare. But when you look at where it was previously distributed, it's mostly focused on where you would find calcareous flushes, calcareous fens. And actually, there's not that many sites around the UK, so species that are typically associated with those kind of habitats are often pretty rare. The sad part is with the Clubbed General is that it's now pretty much restricted to 2 regions. It seems to be significant decline across the country, and which is a bit of a shame, with the stronghold being in Anglesey. An interesting fact is that it was actually first recorded in Wales only in 1980. It probably was there beforehand, but maybe been misidentified. It's difficult to say, but relatively recent find, really. So that's the kind of its distribution in Anglesey. You can see that it's mostly clustered around the Anglesey fens, where it can be found. So it's considered endangered and nationally rare species. Interestingly, there's actually 6 sites in Wales where the Clubbed General is a qualifying feature for the triple SI. And if you don't know what triple SI is, it stands for Site of Special Scientific Interest, and it's a legal protected status for that particular area. So the fact that it's a qualifying feature for those sites means that it's protected under the triple SI designation. So it means it's quite a significant, important species for insect conservation. Looking at some of the counts, these counts were very kindly provided for us by Mike Howe from Natural Resources Wales. And you can see this is from Causa Saerwenynnen Fawr. There are other similar counts for other fen sites in Anglesey, but they all show much the same kind of pattern, where we can see that they first really started recording them in the 1980s. And there was a bit of a boom in the mid-90s where the populations were much higher, and then something of a drop off again, as we've seen over the kind of the last sort of 20, 30 years. And the reason for this is mostly because a lot of the habitat has probably become unsuitable. Some of the areas have become very rank and overgrown with rushes and willow scrub. But also there could be other factors there as well, potentially climate change that has affected their numbers. Difficult to say. But there are current management practices to try and help this species. So there, like I said, with the scrub being much of a problem, there's a lot of work now to try and control some of the scrub. And we saw from the video that grazing has become a management tool. But we have a definition that we try to aim for in the conservation of this species. And that is essentially what we're looking for is for every 1 square metre patch, it should typically contain bare and waterlogged substrate with less than 40% cover of low vegetation. So 60% of that needs to be open habitat. And that's quite an important definition for this species. And it's certainly sort of an optimal conditions to kind of keep it going. So that's something that the conservation charities, the RSPB and NRW are sort of aiming for up there. Additionally, as I said before, the nectar feed on umbellifers, so we have to make sure that they're available in the roundabout habitat. So if they're not within the wetland system, they have to certainly be close by. Without that, then there's no food for the adult. As important with the conservation, you have to think about not just about what the larvae requires, but what the adults require too. And sometimes that means managing habitats in multiple different ways. So there's a lot of scrub rush management that's been going on, as well as grazing with some of the little ponies. They help manage these open spaces and sort of keep them at bay. So there's a little bit of information here about soldier flies. If you want to do some further reading, there's The British Soldier Flies and Their Allies by Alan Stubbs and Martin Drake. It's a really nice book, definitely worth getting. I think it's about 20 quid, something like that. So definitely worth the money. And also there's the Soldier Flies and Allies recording scheme, which is found on the Dipterist Forum website. If you're really interested in getting involved in flies, then the Dipterist Forum is an absolute fountain of knowledge and information, all sorts of identification material on there, including a really nice identification guide for soldier flies, which is a little bit quite pictorial. It's really nice and definitely worth getting if you're interested. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the cliff mason bee. Okay, welcome back. Okay, so the second half of this talk is we're going to look at the cliff mason bee. It is also known as the large mason bee, and it's sort of interchangeably called that. So the hardcore bee people nowadays will keep telling us we shouldn't really call it the large mason bee anymore, because actually there are other mason bees that are almost as large as the cliff mason bee. And so just for clarity, it tends to be called the cliff mason bee these days, and we'll find out why as we go along. So what is a mason bee? Okay, well, these are solitary bees. If you're not aware of different types of bees, they're a solitary bee, which means they don't live in large communities, generally speaking, like you would find with honeybees or bumblebees. They are generally solo artists when it comes to their reproductive strategy. But this isn't necessarily that helpful, because about 90% of our UK bees are solitary. So that's about 250 species that are known to actually not live in a sort of communal fashion. It's a part of the genus Osmia, and the family Megachilidae, and there's about 13 species of Osmia in the UK. So what's an osmia? Well, an osmia is a group of bees. They construct nests using masticated materials, and by that we mean materials that they've chewed up first. So they use their saliva to break down material and create a kind of a glue or a building material, similar to kind of paper mache, I guess. But often they'll use plant material, and sometimes they'll use sand and soil and that kind of thing. They'll often take advantage of existing cavities. There's a bit of a myth that masonry bees dig holes in people's in the mortar in people's houses, and those kind of things. Actually, that's not true. They're not really capable of digging into the mortar in your house, you'd be pleased to know. But they will use any existing holes that you have in the mortar, and they take advantage of those kind of little cracks and crevices. And they'll often use these to a larger extent. And they'll also use holes in plant stems and dead wood as well. So they're not specifically restricted to stones and masonry. So different species within the group tend to exhibit different kind of behavioural patterns, and that's a real key if you want to try to identify these groups, is to try and get your head around the behavioural differences. And actually, that's often an easier way of identifying some of these species than learn to identify what they look like. There are some as well that also make their homes in empty snail shells, and this is one of the snails that we have in the collection here that had been where the snail is long gone, and the bees just take advantage of the void. Now you can see that some of this shell has actually been cut away because they'll crawl down to the bottom of the snail shell and then cap it off. This one probably looks like it's used some leaf mastic, which is chewed up leaf material, and then they'll lay their eggs and put their larvae will develop in the bottom of the egg of the snail shells. And sometimes you don't know which ones they are. So if you go down to the coast and you collect some snail shells, and you collect, say, 20 snail shells, there's a possibility that in there that you might actually get a little Osmia solitary bee. And then they emerge, they'll chew their way out. You can see this little hole just there in the cap on this particular snail. So some of them have a little preference for snail shells. And they'll also use the gaps in the masonry. I've covered that as well. And sandy exposed banks. So this is the one we're going to be quite interested as we go forward for the cliff mason bee. They do particularly like exposed sandy banks. This is an example here. You can see that there's sort of cracks and crevices in there that they can get themselves into, and sometimes they can do a bit of burrowing as well. So they can be difficult to identify from other solitary bees. I'm going to do my best to try and help us navigate through identification in the field. A lot of people probably have different features that they look for these guys when they see them. And so a lot of it comes down to experience once you get yourself out there and have a look. But generally speaking, they're small to large bees, which is not that helpful, often with colourful body hairs or metallic tints. So this image, you can't really see it that clearly, but it has a kind of a metallic tint to it. Some of them have that kind of look. They have a large boxy head with very powerful jaws, which is presumably they need those big jaws to really chew down that material and then dig their way through sandy banks for some of them. So they do have these sort of big square heads and quite round bodies as well. There's a bit of a close up there of some of the jaws to show you how impressively large they are. Yeah, they're quite nice looking things. They also have a pollen brush underneath the abdomen. So these are pollen collectors. So what they'll do is they'll land on particular flowers, and many of the osmias can be restricted to the kind of the plant species that they like to collect pollen from. But you can see here just underneath is sort of, in this species, it's like a golden furry fluff that's underneath the abdomen, and that's the pollen brush. That's where they'll collect all their pollen and they'll push it down into this pollen brush and then take it back to their nests, which will then use the pollen presumably to create a kind of bee bread help the larvae develop. They also have, now this is quite difficult to see. If you're lucky, you might be able to spot one with a hand lens, or you might be able to pick it up if you've got a particularly good camera, but I'm going to cover it anyway because it's quite an important feature, and that's the parapsidal line. Now, if you can just about see it here, there we go, I've highlighted them. The top one, you can see, so it's just on the thorax, just behind the head, but slightly to the sides. You can see one on each side. That they have, some bees have like a long line, so it's the parapsidal line, easy for me to say, and you can see they're usually quite long and relatively distinct in many species. But in Osmia, with all the exception of typically of one species, which is Spinulosa, you can see that you can't really see these. They're sort of greatly reduced, and they're often small and round, and that's something a little bit more distinctive that is typically shared within the species within this genus. Oh, there you go. I highlighted in the red to give you a bit of a better view. There you go. All right. They also have, and once again, they can be quite difficult to see. So you get your hand lens out. You can sometimes spot these, which is the aerolium, which is these kind of. I don't know if you can see. There's like a little sensory organ in between the claws, and that's another feature that's quite typical within this genus. And like I said before, the key thing is observing their behaviour. Look at what they're doing. Might help you work out what species that you've got. All right, so once again, the sexes are quite different in the mason, cliff mason bee. You'll notice that the males on the left, you'll notice it's a little bit more gingery. It's got a sort of a white face as opposed to the female has a dark face. They're also quite a lot smaller, so there are some differences between the males and females that can cause some confusion. But we'll try and work our way through them as best we can. So how do you identify the females? Well, they've got the thorax and the base of the abdomen have these lovely sort of browny, gingerish hairs. And the thorax is usually, this photograph doesn't do it justice really as to how kind of rusty and a colour that it can be. And that kind of bleeds into the sort of hairy top to the abdomen, and then it sort of fades a little bit into a darker base, a darker abdomen. They're quite a large species, 12 to 13 millimeters, which is why they were originally given their large mason bee name. So sort of distinctively larger as masonry bees go. There's some other features as well that you might be able to spot. So they have these typically dark hairs, and they're called the scopal hairs, which are basically on the back legs. These are the hairs underneath on the base of the back legs. So if you look at the one on the left, so Osmia xanthomilana, that's our target bee. You can see they're quite dark hairs, and this is the example of Osmia bicornis on the right. They're sort of pale, so they have a dark hair on the underside of the leg, as opposed to a pale one. And you can spot this with a hand lens and also with a camera if you get the right angle. The face is also dark. They call this the clypeus, which is the area in between the eyes but above the mouth. And in our fellow, the Clubbed General, that's Osmia xanthomilana, they're really dark. And if you compare it to the one on the right, you can see that it's got pale hairs. So that's quite a nice feature. Big black face there. There we go. Perfect. Easy to spot. They also have this. Annoyingly, there are other osmias that have some of these features. But if you can find a female bee that's got a big black face, then that'll get you down to probably Osmia xanthomilana or Osmia pilicornis. They can be quite difficult to separate, but there is a trick, and that's if you can look at what's called the propedal triangle. So right behind the head is a bit where in the Clubbed General we had those two big spines in the scutellum. In bees, they call it the propedal triangle. And you can see here there's a difference in bees. In our fella, the cliff mason bee, it's quite shiny. And in the Osmia pilicornis, which we can be easily confused with, it's actually quite a dull finish, like a matte finish. And you can see this with a hand camera or a hand lens if you're looking. You've got one in a pot. So yeah, you can see it. There we go. Just highlighted for you if that's not obvious. There we go. They're also slightly different in size between xanthomilana and pilicornis. So, even though there are similar features, they are different in size. So the cliff mason bee is much larger. So, but the smaller ones, sometimes you get a small female and they can be a similar size. So just to help save any confusion, you want to have a look at that propedal triangle if you can get a view of it. The males are a bit more tricky, actually, but they tend to have these sort of complete orange to grey hairs that run along the body. The older they get, the more grey they can get, these hairs, and they kind of run across the whole abdomen. It's a real gingery-looking thing. Now, this is a key feature that you might not be able to spot, but I'm going to give it you anyway. And that is on the back leg, it has what's called a basitarsal bump. So on the tarsus and the tarsus nearest the tibia on the back leg, you can just see it's got this distinctive looking bump. And you can spot it, I guess, maybe if you're particularly keen with a hand lens. But for the males, really, it's all about where they are and what kind of behaviour that they're doing is a good indicator. They can be confused with the vernal mining bee that likes similar habitats, but you can see that the cliff mason bee is a much rounder bodied, whereas the vernal mining bee, which is the one on the left, sorry, Colitis canicularis, has got a pointy abdomen, but both of them have white fluffy faces, so that can be easy to get them confused. There we go. I think the cliff mason bee actually has got a lot more gingery as well, so you can sort of see on the back there they're a bit more golden. And both these bees are actually pretty rare, so even if you find a vernal mining bee, I think it's a lovely thing to see. They both like those kind of sandy habitats. Yeah, okay, so here we go. So we've got a specimen of the female cliff mason bee. You can see it's a lovely big ginger fluff. And as it sort of spins round, and you can spot the darker hairs on the face there, and the darker hairs on the back leg as well, that are sort of classic for this species. The video of the male. Very difficult to see. You can see, once again, you can see how they've got these lovely white fluffy faces and a really gingery thorax. It's very difficult to see that bump on the back leg. If you're lucky, you might be able to just spot it as it spins around. It's definitely there, I promise. Okay, so a bit about the habitat and the life cycle. So here is this is a typical habitat for the for Osmia's anthomalana, for the cliff mason bee, and as the name describes, it likes these open sandy cliffs you get on the coast. It's a specialized really species to this habitat, and it's really quite fussy. It's not just any old exposed cliff that you'll find them in. They're quite dependent on the availability of this habitat. So, really, they're the cliff mason bee by name, cliff mason bee by nature. That's probably the best way to describe them. And they tend to live on the tufts at the base of exposed cliffs. Sometimes they're within it as well. There's a little arrow here that points into one of their colonies, and you sort of can see that often they kind of like to be the base of grasses. And there's a discussion about this as to why that might be, and one of the theories is that it might be that they use where the sand slumps slightly, where the grass roots. It might create little voids, little crevices that they can crawl in or they can excavate. So it might make the job a bit easier for them, potentially. It also might provide a little bit of shade out for the entrance as well. So yeah, particularly disturbed sandy soils. They also will lay their nests in rabbit holes, and they can be very difficult to spot because obviously they're down underground. But sometimes the adults can be seen emerging from rabbit holes as well. So they'll take advantage of that, particularly sandy rabbit holes in coastal areas. Additionally, the availability of a freshwater seepage is quite important. And we're not talking about, like we are with the Clubbed General, it has to be reasonably fast flowing. You can often be where water very slowly percolates through sand. And that's quite important because when they come to create the mastics, or when they come to create their muddy clay, then they need to have that additional moisture just helps with that process. So here's a picture of a lovely female that Liam Olds very kindly produced me with, and you can see that in its mouth, there you go, it's producing a little bit of it's got a little bit of mud going, and it's obviously doing a bit of creating, and it'll use this mud to build its cells, and it makes these little clay pots, which are really quite attractive looking things. As you can see here, they're not normally exposed like this, but at the end of the season, when the wind starts to erode the sand, sometimes they can become exposed and you can see them. But it's typically the brood size is between 5 to 8 individuals. There have been up to 15 recorded, but it's difficult to know whether that was actually one individual or several, but typically between 5 to 8. Generally, each of these nests is one female. So one nest site is one female. There have been records of multiple females using the same site, but they're not entirely sure whether that's because some females can be sneaky and try and lay their eggs in other female cups. And these cups are sort of made of a mixture of clay, sort of sand. They make a clay using sand and grit. When they use a foliage mastic, so the plant material they'll chew down as well to add in. It's almost a bit like when they used to make the wattle and daub houses in many respects. When I think about it, so it's quite a solid little structure. And these cells are inserted in the soil at the base of the grass clumps. Sometimes they can be on exposed rock faces as well, less commonly, but there you go. And usually the burrows, when they make a burrow, they can be to the depth of about 5 to 10 centimetres, depending. And that can be quite important, I guess, because if you're trying to get the protection of the sand in your burrow, then the closer you are to the surface, the more likely there is to be wind erosion that might affect your little cups, your little cells. Like most bees, they have parasites, potentially parasites. So there's the ruby-tailed wasp, which is Chrysaora hirsute, which in Europe has been recorded as a parasite of the cliff masonry bee, but that's not been confirmed in the UK. But the white-spotted sapaiga, I can never say that, sapaiga, as it has been recorded in the UK. And that's not parasitizing the cliff masonry bee, but that's not unusual because actually they're known to specialize in parasitizing osmias. So it wouldn't be surprising that they will use cliff masonry bees. Now, don't really know what level of impact the parasitic actually have on cliff mason bee in the UK. I just don't actually know the answer to that. That might be something that other people will probably be able to answer. Yeah, so the nest entrances are not always obvious, and they can be confused with those vernal mining bees, which are also out early in the year, and will use a solitary bee that uses burrows in the sand. So just because you've got burrows in the sand entrance doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the cliff masonry bee. And if you have, then excitement should follow. There's, like I said before, there's a question as to whether they excavate or whether they will use existing cracks in the sand. But the chances are they probably do a bit of both. So they're univoltine, and if you don't know what that means, it basically means that they produce one brood a year, with the adults being on the wing in late April to mid-July. They have been observed emerging as early as mid-April, and with climate change, it's probably likely that we'll see them emerging at unusual times of the year. And the males have a tendency to appear first, and then followed by the females. And I thought I'd emphasize the fact that they don't make honey. A lot of people seem to think that bees make honey and honeybees make honey, but cliff masonry bees don't make honey. They like pollen. So they will feed on nectar for themselves to keep them going. But generally speaking, they feed on pollen. And they're really quite fussy with what pollen they use. So they tend to just use various different kinds of vetch. But it's almost exclusively bird's foot trefoil and occasionally horseshoe vetch. So this picture on the right is of bird's foot trefoil. It's not an uncommon species necessarily, but it does like quite poor conditions, poor soils, and is often found in coastal habitats. But so they almost entirely require a good supply of bird's foot trefoil or horseshoe vetch near to where their nest. And the males have been known, they obviously don't feed on pollen, but they're known to nectar feed from a variety of fairly common plants, so buttercups, ground ivy, dandelions, rough hawksbit, that kind of thing. But they're really poor dispersers. We know they don't fly very far, so that actually you need to have a reasonable abundance of bird's foot trefoil near to where the exposed cliffs are that they can use for their habitats or near to the rabbit burrows or what have you. So they need to be quite close by, otherwise there's a good chance that they're not likely to find it. So where are they found? Well, as you can see from this map, it's a somewhat disappointing, bit depressing distribution. You can see historically there's a few sites down in the south of England where they were found, but not anymore. Officially, they're found at 2 sites in the UK, and both of those are found on the Llyn Peninsula. The exact locations we're not going to give away because they're so incredibly rare now that we don't want people going to try and collect them And often people go to trying to see them. They might go scrabbling up the cliff faces to try and look for them, and actually end up destroying the nests that are there instead of looking for them. So this particular species, we don't want to be too descriptive as to where we can find them. Though if you're a bit canny from the region, you can probably recognise where they are from the photographs I've been showing you. But that's okay. Historically, they were recorded from Cumbria, Devon, Durham, Essex, so on and so forth. So they had a reasonably broad distribution, but they were almost completely retracted now. They were known on the Isle of Wight until the 1990s, where the population sort of very slowly and steadily declined until they just blipped out of existence there. And unfortunately, in North Wales, there's been a similar pattern for many sites that it was found. The numbers have sort of decreased and depleted and sort of disappeared. You can see from their sort of European distribution, they're not particularly common across Europe either. And it's interesting that in the UK, they're sort of mostly coastally distributed historically. But in Europe, it's difficult to get that pattern. Well, actually, there's what's considered two subspecies of Osmia milana. One that lives on the coastal areas and one that tends to live in the more mountainous regions. And the more mountainous regions ones, even though they're also contracting, seem to be doing much better than the coastal subspecies, which is becoming more and more rare. So recent count for Wales, we're just going to call it Site A and Site B, given that they're only found on 2 sites now in the whole of the UK. You can see from this is Site A. This is the first site. You can see that actually, it's a bit of a peak, 23 females in 2007. So not exactly high numbers at all by any stretch of the imagination. But sort of drifted. In 2019, there was only 1 or 2 females recorded from the first site. And in fact, there haven't actually been very many recent observations at all from Site A. So there's a good chance now that they're probably lost to that site too. Hopefully not. There's some good management work going on there. Hopefully they won't have clicked out of existence, but it's possible that they're now down to only a single site left in the whole of the UK. And that's this site, our Site B. And if you look at the numbers there, you can see actually, they've had peaks of where there've been 40 females recorded in the early noughties. More recently, you can see the numbers seem to be drifted down to 10, 20, then 5, then it just says several. In 2021, there was 15 recorded. Now, my understanding is that that last year there was about 15 recorded also. However, a landslip that occurred over the wintertime actually destroyed 5 of these nest sites. And the larvae, a lot of people think that the larvae overwinter in these cells, and actually that's not necessarily the case. What happens is they tend to develop into the adults late in the autumn, the end of summer, autumn, and then they actually stay in the cells as adults over winter, so that they can emerge when the opportunity is optimal. But yeah, the landslide was quite significant because it essentially reduced the population by a third overnight. And this is kind of, I guess, this is a risk that you take if you're an opportunist that likes disturbed ground. But you're an opportunist that likes disturbed ground that's not particularly good at dispersal, then you're certainly putting all your eggs into one basket, So that's a disappointing statistic, and it'll be interesting to see how the guys who are doing the survey, Sean Davis and the RSPB and Mike Howard doing the survey work up there. It'll be interesting to see how these recover over the summer. So yeah, of the 24 species of endangered bees listed on the British Red Data Book, only 4 of them have been recorded from a single site. So it just goes to show the level of rareness that we really have for the cliff mason bee. There's only 4 species of bees that are found from one particular location. So this is a species that is in incredible risk of extinction from this country, and it's rare elsewhere. So it's a really high conservation priority for us. No surprises. It's classed as an endangered species in the UK. It's an RDB1, which you remember from the start of the talk, is the older classification, but it's still valid and still informative. So what are the conservation issues for this bee? Why are we having problems with it? Where does it go in? It keeps, why does it keep sort of disappearing? Well, It's difficult to say, but a lot of the theories is that the way we manage our coastlines is a big problem. We overstabilize our coastal systems. We've overdeveloped our coastal systems. We've removed a lot of the habitat that's suitable for them. It's important that these open sandy cliffs are available with the food source, with the lotus, the bird's foot trefoil, and also with those freshwater seepages. So they're not necessarily common to have all those things in one place. So the amount of habitat's been reduced. The particular site we have here, you can see that there's actually a footpath that runs along as well. You can just about see where the shorter vegetation is, but there's a footpath that actually runs over the top of the nest site. And this is kind of it's a difficult one because disturbance is obviously something that they need. So the act of having a footpath keeps the vegetation low and does probably disturb the cliff face. But obviously, there's always the risk of over disturbance where people can actually damage the nest without realizing. So that's going to be a particular risk. They've had difficulty with managing some of the grazing regimes in the areas, and it's not criticism of the local farmers who've been really keen to be involved in some of the work to protect these bees, to be fair, but it can be quite difficult to get that balance with productive farming, the amount of grazing that's suitable so that you keep the food source available and you don't overgraze it to oblivion, but you also don't want it to become too rank, and you want some of those open sandy patches available. There has been a reduction in rabbit numbers through myxomatosis and control in some of the areas, particularly the site where we think we may have lost the population recently. But now, action's been put in place to make sure that the rabbit numbers there are actually maintained, so that we can get rabbit burrows in and some extra disturbance, which could be better for the bees in the area. The risk of climate change could be quite severe. We don't really know at this point what part climate change has to play. But there is a little bit of concern that with the males emerging first, that sometimes they may emerge. There's a possibility they might start emerging too early and then missing the windows for females. And this has been observed in other species. It's something that is a real risk potentially for their cliff masonry bee. So what's the strategy to protect these guys? Well, there's management agreements with farmers that are in place. The RSPB are working closely with the landowners in these areas, and they're on board and they're really keen to try and make sure their management is of benefit to these species. And actually, some of the management the farms are doing is potentially more important than as if they weren't doing any management. In respect to the sandy cliffs, there has been work to try and open up new sandy cliffs, exposed cliffs in areas close to known colonies. Not obviously in the same areas. You don't want to create any disturbance in the areas where these bees are known, because you've got that risk of changing the habitat composition, which would be detrimental for them. So there has been work to try and open up new habitats nearby that we might be able to tease them in. My understanding has been sort of mixed success with that kind of work. And also continue monitoring. We need to know what's going on with these populations. So there's a lot of work being done to keep an eye on them, to try and work out what's going on and see if we can manage accordingly. So there's a lot of work that's been done looking at the abundance of food sources nearby. So plenty of quadrats laid out to try and make sure there's plenty of food availability, and also going out looking for new nest sites. It's a lovely picture of Sean, who's actually looking to see if there's nest sites that we've missed. We don't know where everything is. That's the reality. And actually, so there's a big effort being going to look to see if we're missing colonies that we don't know about, that we need to protect and we need to do management for. And also counts to look at what's going on with the populations in the UK so that we can respond appropriately. Well, there you go. So a little bit more information if you're interested in learning about solitary bees, and in particular masonry bees. Then there's a lot of literature available, probably more so than there is in the soldier beetles. There's a nice book out, the Steve Falk book, which is a field guide to bees, is very nice. The George Elson, Mike Edwards book, which is a little bit more microscope work, but you might be able to do a lot of it with hand lenses, to be fair. They're really nice books to own, and really useful. There's the Bees and Wasps and Ants recording scheme, BWARS as it's known as. If you go onto the BWARS website, there's a whole heap of information about people to get people interested, how you can record these things, how you can get help with identification. And the other website to go and look at is Bug Life, the Bug Life website. They've got loads of really useful bits of information on there as well that can help you in your endeavours. Okay, so just a little bit on what we can do to help some of these species, what you can do to try and help some of these species. Well, I think what we want to emphasize from this talk is that please do not collect these species. If you're an insect collector and you've got a gap in that collection, then leave that gap. If you want to come and see what these specimens look like, then please come to the museum. We have specimens that were collected some time ago that are in really good condition. And if you want to come and look at them, please contact us and we can arrange that for you, no problem. But yeah, please do not collect them. Some of these species are now in such low numbers. I mean, we could be talking only 10 females for the cliff masons being left in the whole of the country. So just the removal of one could have a significant impact on the success chances of these species. So whereas, it's good to learn how to identify these things in the field, not so good to learn necessarily about how to collect them. So yeah, looking for volunteer opportunities at your local conservation charities. If you're interested in working with some of these groups, then please get in touch with the RSPB if you're in North Wales, or Bug Life potentially as well, and Natural Resources Wales, and go and try and volunteer for some of these guys. Join your local communities, your local groups, and then you can potentially be involved in actively doing conservation work for these species on the ground. And support your local Natur and Byth projects. These projects are fantastic and they're going on all across Wales at the moment. There's all sorts of different species groups to be involved with. Please get in touch with the Natur and Byth teams and get involved. Also, if you're looking to try and get into conservation, there are some Natur and Byth training schemes that are on their website. There's a little bit of a link there, but what I would suggest is that you just Google it. And there's some deadlines imminent for some of these things that are coming up over the next few months, but there's probably more opportunities coming out in the future. So if you're interested in learning how to become a conservation officer, working on these kind of species, then do go and look at the Natur and Byth project website. There might be some good opportunities for you. Just some acknowledgements to start with. I want to first of all acknowledge Ben Rosen at the museum here, who's been significant help trying to put these things together. Wouldn't have been able to do it without him, as well as some of our colleagues in different organisations within the Natur and Byth project, which is Mike Howe, Natural Resources Wales, and Claire Sampson, Liam Olds, and Judy Webb and Andrew McLeish for their fantastic photographs. Brilliant. There we go. Thanks for listening. If you guys do have any questions, then I'm not sure I'll put it in here, but please post it if you go onto the museum website. So if you go on it, if you email entomology@museumwales.ac.uk, then you'll get through to us. If you've got any questions, please do ping us an email. Or if you're interested in coming to see our collections or do some work within the museum, please do get in touch with us. Brilliant. Thank you very much for listening.